The letter hit the pine table between them like a gunshot. Julia Finley had ridden 11 miles through a dust storm to deliver it, her chestnut mare lathered and blowing, her own lips cracked and bleeding from the alkaline wind. She had not expected to find Harlan Morgan the way she found him, standing at the window of the Broken Spur Ranch house with a glass of whiskey in his hand and grief carved into every line of his face. She had not expected the way his eyes moved to her face first before the envelope, as though she were the message and the paper was secondary. She had expected him to be monstrous. That was what everyone in Cimarron had told her. Harlan Morgan, they said. Hard as flint and twice as cold. A man who drove cattle across 3 territories without losing sleep over what he left behind. A man who had not come to his own father's funeral because he was in the middle of a drive and the cattle came first. A man who had reportedly sent his last business partner packing with nothing but the shirt on his back and a borrowed horse. That was the man she had come to deliver this letter to. A letter from her employer. A letter that carried inside it the single most explosive secret Julia had uncovered in 6 years of working as a legal clerk for the firm of Aldridge and Bell in Santa Fe. A letter that named Harlan Morgan as the sole rightful heir to the Broken Spur, and simultaneously accused him of a fraud so catastrophic it would strip him of everything he had built in the decades since his father disowned him. She had thought delivering it would be simple. Arrive, hand it over, leave before sunset. But now Harlan Morgan was looking at her with those dark and terrible eyes, and he had not touched the envelope at all. Instead, he set his whiskey glass down with a quiet deliberateness that somehow felt louder than anything else in the room. "I know what's in that letter," he said. His voice was low, the kind of low that came not from softness but from absolute control. "My father's solicitor sent word 3 days ago." Julia kept her spine straight. She had practiced keeping her spine straight in rooms full of men who wanted her to bend. "Then my work here is done." "No." He said it simply, no drama in it, the way a man states a fact about the weather. "It is not." She was already reaching for her hat, which she had placed on the corner of his desk when she came in, shaking dust from her hair. Her fingers found the brim, and she was turning toward the door when his next words stopped her as cleanly as a rope around her ankles. "Stay until you hear mine." She turned back slowly. The afternoon light was coming through the window behind him in amber sheets, and it caught the dust still floating from when she had entered, and it made the whole room look like it was suspended inside something amber and ancient and dangerous. "Your message," she repeated. "I did not commit the fraud named in that letter." He met her eyes without flinching, without blinking, without any of the deflection she would have expected from a guilty man. "And whoever told you I did is trying to bury me. I need one person in this county who is not already bought. You rode 11 miles through a dust storm to hand me a death sentence. The least you can do is give me an hour to tell you the other half of the story." Julia Finley had been raised by a mother who told her that a woman's greatest strength was knowing when to walk out of a room. She had also been raised by a father who told her that a woman's second greatest strength was knowing when to sit back down. She sat back down. She did not know yet that she would not leave the Broken Spur for a very long time. 3 weeks earlier, Julia had been sitting at her desk in the offices of Aldridge and Bell when the letter arrived. The firm occupied the 2nd floor of a narrow building on Palace Avenue in Santa Fe, New Mexico Territory, and Julia had worked there since she was 22 years old. She was now 28. In those 6 years she had made herself indispensable, not because she was the most educated person in the office. She had never been permitted to attend formal law school, but because she read everything, remembered everything, and noticed the things that the attorneys themselves were too comfortable to see. Richard Aldridge was 63 and gout-ridden, and almost entirely honest. Franklin Bell was 41 and physically robust, and almost entirely not. Julia had known for 2 years that Bell was skimming from estate accounts. She had said nothing, because she had no proof that would stand in front of a judge, and because the one time she had attempted to raise a concern with Aldridge, he had looked at her with the particular exhausted kindness of a man who does not want the world to be complicated and said, "Julia, I am sure there is an explanation." The letter that arrived 3 weeks before she rode to the Broken Spur was addressed to the firm in the matter of the estate of Cornelius Morgan, deceased. It was long, dense with legal language, and at first reading appeared to be nothing more than a routine probate matter. An old cattle rancher had died in Colfax County, leaving behind a sizable spread and a disputed will. The sole heir named in the most recent will was his son, Harlan Morgan. But the letter also contained a sworn affidavit from a man named Gerald Whitmore, who claimed to be a former business associate of Harlan Morgan, and who swore in elaborate and specific detail that Harlan had defrauded his father out of a significant sum of money some years prior, money that the elder Morgan had intended to use to expand the ranch. Franklin Bell had read the letter first. Julia had watched him read it, seen the particular stillness that came over him when he was calculating something, and when he handed the file to her to begin organizing the paperwork for a response, she had read it twice more, very carefully. The affidavit was too good, too detailed, too perfectly structured to arrive exactly when it was needed, timed to the death of the old man to the very week. Gerald Whitmore had spelled out dates, amounts, even specific conversations between himself and Harlan Morgan, conversations that, if you read them closely, contained 2 references to events that Julia knew from other paperwork in the file had happened 3 months after Whitmore claimed the conversations took place. Someone had fabricated the affidavit, or at the very least, heavily embellished it, and Bell had received it with no apparent surprise. Julia had said nothing. She had done what she was told. She had organized the file and prepared the paperwork, and when Bell told her the firm needed a messenger to ride to Colfax County and deliver the formal notice to Harlan Morgan himself, since the matter was sensitive enough to require personal delivery rather than the post, she had volunteered. She had told herself it was because she wanted to see his face when he read it. She had told herself she would know from his reaction whether he was guilty. She had told herself a great many things on the ride north from Santa Fe, through Espanola and then east toward the mountains and down into the broad cattle country of Colfax County, where the grass came back after the desert, and the sky opened up blue and enormous, and the wind tasted like pine and distance. What she had not told herself was the real reason she had volunteered. The real reason was that she needed to know the truth, not just for Harlan Morgan's sake, but for her own. Because if the affidavit was fabricated, then Bell had participated in it. And if Bell had participated in it, then the firm of Aldridge and Bell was involved in something criminal, and Julia Finley was not going to spend another day of her life handing legal documents to people on behalf of criminals. She had spent enough of her life handing things to people who didn't deserve what she was giving them. She had made that decision very quietly on the last stretch of road before the Broken Spur, with the dust storm rising to the west like a red curtain being drawn across the sky. And now she was sitting across a pine table from Harlan Morgan, and the amber light was deepening toward gold, and he was pouring her a glass of water from a clay pitcher because she had not drunk anything since morning, and she was watching his hands and thinking that they were not the hands of a man who had nothing to say for himself. "The money my father lost," Harlan said, settling into the chair across from her with his elbows on the table, "was lost before I ever came back to this county." He sent $3,000 to a land speculation outfit operating out of Denver in the spring of 1882. They were selling shares in irrigation rights along the Arkansas River. It was a swindle. The company dissolved before summer, every investor lost everything, and my father spent the next 2 years convinced it was my fault because I had been the one who brought home a newspaper from Denver that mentioned the scheme. Julia said, "The affidavit claims you took the money directly. The affidavit is a lie. Gerald Whitmore says he was present when you convinced your father to invest." Gerald Whitmore has been in the employ of Declan Rourke for the last 4 years. Harlan watched her face to see if the name landed. It landed. I thought you might know that name. She did. Declan Rourke was a cattle baron operating out of Taos who had been buying up land across Colfax County for the better part of a decade. The firm of Aldridge and Bell represented 3 of his New Mexico business interests. Julia had handled paperwork for at least 2 of those matters herself. Rourke wants this land, she said slowly. Rourke has wanted this land for 6 years. My father refused to sell every time he came. The Broken Spur sits on the only year-round water source for 20 miles in any direction. You control that water, you control grazing rights for the whole southeastern section of the county. Harlan leaned forward slightly. My father knew that. He held out. And when he died, Rourke needed to make sure that the heir who took over wouldn't hold out too. So the plan was to discredit you before you could consolidate the estate. More than discredit me. The affidavit is the first step. If it holds up, it forms the legal basis for a civil suit claiming I have no right to inherit property from a man I defrauded. It would tie up probate for years, drain whatever assets the estate has in legal fees, and eventually force a sale just to settle the debts. Julia was quiet for a moment, turning the glass of water in her hands. Outside, the dust storm had eased, and the wind had dropped, and she could hear the cattle somewhere in the distance, that low collective sound they made when the heat of the day was passing. She could also hear her own thoughts, which were telling her several uncomfortable things in rapid succession. Why didn't you say any of this when you first saw the letter? Because I said it to the last person who came out here with legal papers, and that person went back to Santa Fe and filed a motion that used my own testimony to argue I had acknowledged the debt. His jaw tightened for just a moment. I learned not to talk until I knew who I was talking to. And what makes you think you can trust me? He looked at her for a long moment. The gold light was almost gone now, sliding toward the orange of early evening, and in it his face was very serious and very still. You rode 11 miles through a dust storm, he said. Most messengers turn around at the first sign of weather. You didn't. That tells me you had a reason to get here that was more than just the job. She should not have told him. She knew that even as she was telling him, watching his expression shift from guarded to intensely focused as she described what she had found in the affidavit, the dates that didn't match, the events that couldn't have happened when Whitmore claimed they did. She told him about Bell's lack of surprise when the letter arrived. She told him about Rourke's connection to the firm. She kept her voice steady and her observations precise, the way she always had in that office when the attorneys actually bothered to listen to her, which was not often enough. When she was done, Harlan Morgan sat back in his chair and exhaled slowly through his nose. You've been holding this since before you left Santa Fe. I wasn't sure until I heard your version, and now I think you're telling the truth. She set the glass down, which means I came out here to deliver a poisoned document on behalf of a man who is either corrupt or being used by someone who is, and I don't know which one yet. Does it matter which one? It matters for what comes next. He nodded slowly. You're thinking about what you can do about it. I'm thinking about what the law can do about it, which, in this territory in 1884, is somewhat limited when the men with money are also the men with the judge's ears. She said it flatly without bitterness because it was simply true, but limited is not the same as nothing. There was a long pause, and then Harlan Morgan said something that surprised her. He said, "You should stay for supper." She blinked. It was so ordinary after everything they had just said that it almost made her laugh. That's not exactly a legal strategy. No, he agreed. But you have been on the road since before sunrise. Your horse needs water and rest. And there is a storm cell coming in from the west that will make the road back to Cimarron impassable after dark. Those are the practical reasons. He stood and moved toward the cast iron stove that occupied one corner of the kitchen, lifting the lid on a pot that had been simmering unattended. The other reason is that I would like to continue this conversation, and I would like to do it over something that is not fear or accusations." Julia considered the window, which showed her that he was right about the weather. The sky to the west had taken on that particular greenish-yellow cast that meant lightning was building somewhere behind the mountains. She considered her horse, who had been through enough for one day. She considered the fact that she had not eaten since dawn. She said, "I'll unsaddle my mare. I'll have supper ready when you come back." She led her mare around to the barn herself, refusing the offer of help from the young hand who appeared from somewhere behind the bunkhouse. His name was Tomas, she would learn later, and he was 17 and half Apache and deeply devoted to Harlan Morgan in the uncomplicated way that young people sometimes become devoted to men who treat them decently in a world that largely does not. She worked in silence, rubbing the mare down with a dry cloth she found hanging on a nail, refilling the water trough, measuring out oats from a bin. The barn was clean and well kept. The horses in the other stalls were well fed, their coats good. These were not the stables of a man who was careless or cruel. She noticed this the way she noticed everything, adding it to the file she was building in her head. When she came back inside, the table had been cleared of the letter and her hat and the glass of whiskey, and in their place were 2 plates of beef stew and a pan of cornbread that had clearly been baked sometime that afternoon and not, she gathered, specifically for her. Harlan was already seated, and he gestured to the other chair without ceremony. They ate. For the first 10 minutes they talked about small things, practical things, the specifics of the road between Cimarron and Santa Fe, the quality of this year's grass, whether the drought that had been building all summer was likely to break before fall. Julia found, somewhat to her own surprise, that he was easy to talk to in a way she had not expected. He listened when she spoke. He did not finish her sentences or talk over her or look at a point somewhere past her shoulder while she was making a point. He disagreed with her about the drought, citing specific water levels in the creek that fed the Broken Spur's main pasture, and he disagreed with her clearly and directly, and without any suggestion that her opinion was less valid than his because of who she was. She had eaten with a lot of men in the last 6 years. Most of them had found one or more ways to communicate, subtly or not so subtly, that she was an interesting novelty but not quite a serious person. Harlan Morgan communicated nothing of the kind. "How long have you run this place?" she asked, when the first edge of hunger had been taken off and they were both eating more slowly. "Since my father took ill about 3 years ago. Formally since he died in May." He was quiet for a moment. "We were not close in the years between. He sent me off at 18 because we couldn't be in the same county without fighting, and I spent a decade building my own operation in Colorado. Small, nothing like this, but mine." "What did you fight about?" He looked at her with a slight expression of assessment as though deciding how much truth was warranted. Then he said, "Everything. How to run cattle, how to treat the men who worked for us, how to treat the Jicarilla Apache whose land this territory sits on. My father was a man of his time in ways I found difficult to accept." He paused. "And in the last 5 years of his life, he came around somewhat, not all the way, but enough that when he asked me to come back and help him, I came." Julia thought about injustice and about men who changed and about whether change was ever enough. She thought about it and she said, "And now someone wants to take what he built. Someone wants to take what we both built these last 3 years. The Broken Spur as it stands now is as much mine as it was his. I put the new water system in. I renegotiated the grazing agreements. I brought in a new breed of cattle that's better suited to this elevation." Something moved through his expression that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but was very close to both. "I will not let that go." "Then we need to find proof that Whitmore's affidavit is false," Julia said. "Real proof, documents, witnesses." "I have a witness," he said. "My father's foreman, man named Abel Cruz. He was present for every significant business discussion my father had for 20 years, including whatever conversation Whitmore claims to have witnessed. Abel would swear on anything you name that Whitmore was never involved in the Colorado land deal, and that I was never in the room when my father decided to invest." Why hasn't Cruz come forward already? Harlan's expression darkened. Because 2 weeks ago, someone shot his horse out from under him on the road between here and Cimarron. The horse survived. Abel came away with a broken collarbone. He's been laid up since. The message was fairly clear. Julia set her fork down. The implied threat in that sat in the room between them very heavy. Rourke, I can't prove it, not yet. But you believe it. Yes. She looked at the letter, which was on the corner desk now, just visible in the lamplight. She had ridden 11 miles to deliver it, and it now felt like a live thing, something that could still do damage if left alone. What do you need? She said finally. He looked at her steadily. I need someone who knows the law well enough to help me build a case. Someone who has access to the firm's records. Someone who is not already bought by the people trying to bury me. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. Rain started, soft at first and then with real intention, the kind of territorial downpour that could last through the night and fill arroyos to flooding by morning. Julia thought about the road back to Cimarron. She thought about Bell, sitting in his Santa Fe office, not knowing that the woman he had sent as a messenger had spent the evening becoming something else entirely. She thought about her father's voice saying, a woman's second greatest strength is knowing when to sit back down. I'll need somewhere to sleep, she said. He did not smile exactly, but something in his face changed, a fractional easing, like a man who has been holding his breath for a long time and has just been given permission to breathe. There's a room at the east end of the house. It was my sister's years ago. Your sister. She died of fever when I was 17, before I left. He said it simply, without drama, just information. The room is clean. She slept that night in a narrow iron bed with a quilt that smelled like cedar and old lavender, listening to the rain hammer the roof, and she thought about hidden motives and forced choices, and the dark past that seemed to surround this ranch and this man like weather. She thought about Declan Rourke, who she had met twice in Bell's office, and who had the particular charm of a man who is entirely comfortable with the harm he causes, because he has decided it is necessary. She thought about Gerald Whitmore, who she had never met but whose handwriting she now knew in the way she knew handwriting, and who had written a lie in a very careful and deliberate hand. And she thought about Harlan Morgan's face when he had said, "Stay until you hear mine," not begging, not manipulating, just stating a need as directly as a man states a fact about cattle and water rights, as though he had decided that directness was the only currency he trusted anymore. She fell asleep thinking she would stay 3 days at the most, enough to get the information she needed and ride back to Santa Fe with a clear conscience and a course of action. The storm lasted 4 days. On the second day, with the roads running red with mud and her mare sensibly refusing to go anywhere, Julia sat at the kitchen table across from Abel Cruz, who had been brought up from the bunkhouse by Tomas, and who looked at her with dark eyes full of pain from the broken collarbone, and full of something sharper and more useful, which was a very thorough memory. Abel Cruz was 52 years old, the son of a Mexican vaquero and a woman from one of the Taos Pueblo settlements, and he had worked for the Morgan family for 31 years. He had a precise and organized mind that had never been formally educated, but had been trained by 3 decades of managing land, animals, people, and money on behalf of a man who was sometimes reasonable and sometimes not. He remembered dates and sums the way Julia remembered legal language, not because he had written them down, but because they mattered and he had decided to keep them. He told Julia, slowly and in detail, that she wrote down in a small leather-bound notebook she had brought in her saddlebag everything he knew about the Colorado land speculation scheme of 1882. He described the newspaper article. He described Cornelius Morgan reading it at the breakfast table and saying he thought it looked promising. He described the letter Cornelius had written to the Denver company, which Abel had posted himself from Cimarron. He described receiving the news that the company had folded and watching Cornelius sit down very heavily in his chair and not speak for a long time. He described, very specifically, that Gerald Whitmore had never been present for any of this. He had met Whitmore exactly twice, both times in Cimarron, both times in a saloon context, and had found him unremarkable except for a tendency to speak well of Declan Rourke. "When was the first time you met Whitmore?" Julia asked. Abel thought for a moment. "Fall of 1883, October, I think, after the October drive." The earliest date in Whitmore's affidavit was August 1882, a full 14 months before Abel Cruz had ever laid eyes on the man. Julia looked up at Harlan, who was leaning against the doorframe listening. He nodded slightly. He had already known this or suspected it. She could see that. But hearing it stated clearly and chronologically had a different weight. "Will you sign a sworn statement?" she asked Abel, properly witnessed. "I will sign whatever needs signing," Abel said, with great dignity and only a slight tightening around his eyes that showed how much even the effort of sitting upright was costing him. "Mr. Morgan, both of them, the old one and this one, they are the only employers I have ever had who treated me as a man with a mind. I am not going to let a liar take what they built." Julia wrote up the statement that afternoon, sitting at the pine table with the rain still coming down outside, and Harlan bringing her coffee without being asked. She chose her language carefully, because she knew which words would hold up in court and which would not, and she had the particular skill of someone who has spent years doing the work of lawyers without being called one, which was knowing exactly how the system operated and exactly where its weak points were. On the third day, when the rain had slackened to a drizzle, and the immediate urgency of the legal crisis had been somewhat addressed, there was a gap in the pressure, a few hours in the afternoon when there was nothing that needed doing that could be done that day. And it was in that gap that Julia Finley and Harlan Morgan had the first conversation that had nothing to do with the case. She found him at the fence of the east pasture, watching a group of cattle that had been pushed by the storm to the far corner of the field. He was not doing anything in particular, just watching them. She had been walking for the exercise, getting the stiffness of 2 indoor days out of her legs, and she stopped beside him without thinking about whether it was appropriate. They stood in silence for a little while. The drizzle was fine enough to barely feel, and the air smelled like wet grass and something clean that came from the mountains. The cattle moved with slow deliberateness, their breath visible in the cooler air. "Did you always want to do this?" she asked. "Cattle. I always wanted land," he said. "Land that nobody could take away. When you grow up in a place this big, with this much sky, you either want to escape it or you want to own a piece of it forever." He paused. "My father owned his piece. For all his faults, he held this land through drought and depression and every land rush and scheme that came through this territory. That matters. And the Colorado operation, smaller, 300 acres, 50 head, enough to prove to myself that I could build something from nothing." A slight pause. "I sold it when I came back here, put the money into this place." Julia watched the cattle. "You gave up your own thing to come back. It was time." He said it without self-pity, just as a fact. "My father asked. He was dying. Whatever we had fought about, he was still my father." She thought about her own father, who was alive and living in St. Louis and who had not spoken to her in 3 years because she had refused to come home and marry the man he had selected, a man who was respectable and solvent and boring in the specific way of men who have decided to stop growing. She thought about the telegram she had sent him when she got the job at Aldridge and Bell, and the short and noncommittal response he had sent back. "Family is complicated," she said. "Yes." He glanced at her sideways. It was the first time that day that he had looked at her directly, and she felt the weight of it in a way that was different from how she had felt it before. Less like being assessed and more like being seen. "What brought you to Santa Fe?" A woman with your mind doesn't end up as a legal clerk by accident. She was so accustomed to variations of that phrasing, a woman with your mind, usually deployed as a faint and puzzled compliment, that she almost let it go past her the way she usually did. But something about the way he said it, without condescension, just as a genuine question, made her answer honestly. "I wanted to read law. I spent 2 years trying to find someone who would teach me formally." I wrote to 3 law schools. I got 2 polite rejections and 1 very rude one. She kept her voice even. The old anger was there, but it was banked now, useful fuel rather than a fire she couldn't control. Aldridge took me on as a clerk because I typed faster than anyone he'd ever hired, and because I could do legal research that saved him 4 hours a week. 6 years later, I know more about New Mexico territorial law than either of the attorneys I work for. I also know that will never be formally acknowledged. Harlan was quiet for a moment. That's a wrong that should be corrected. Yes, she said, it should. And in the meantime, you're doing what you can within the structure you have. In the meantime, she agreed. They walked back to the house together when the drizzle picked up again, and it was the most natural thing in the world. The 2 of them side by side on the muddy path, and Julia was aware of him in the way she was aware of weather, something large and real that occupied space and had its own patterns and could not be ignored. On the 4th day, the rain stopped entirely, and the roads were still too soft for the wagon but passable on horseback, and Julia had a choice to make. She could ride back to Santa Fe with Abel Cruz's sworn statement and her notebook full of observations and contradictions, and she could go directly to Richard Aldridge and lay everything out. Aldridge was not a bad man. He was a tired and comfortable man, which was its own kind of problem, but he was not dishonest. If she showed him what Bell had done, what Rourke had engineered, there was a real chance he would act. There was also a real chance he would panic and cover it up. She sat with this for an hour at the kitchen table, alone, with her notebook open in front of her and her coffee going cold, and she worked through it with the same methodical care she applied to any legal problem. She made a list of every person who had standing to act and what their likely motivations were. She mapped the connections between Bell and Rourke and Whitmore. She identified 3 other estate matters the firm had handled in the last 2 years in which Rourke was adjacent to a land deal that ended in his favor. It was not one crime. It was a pattern. Harlan found her there when he came in from the morning rounds, wet to the knee from the pasture and smelling like cattle and outdoor air. He looked at her notebook and then at her face and said, "Tell me what you're thinking." She told him, all of it, every thread of the pattern. He listened standing up, too restless to sit, moving from the stove to the window and back, and when she finished he said, "So Bell alone is not enough. You need all 3 of them." "I need all 3 of them, and I need enough documentation to show a judge the pattern, not just the single instance." She tapped the notebook. "Some of this I can get from memory, some of it I need the actual files, which are in Santa Fe, which are in a locked cabinet in Bell's office." Yes, she met his eyes. "I need to go back." Something moved across his face. She had learned in 4 days to read him with more precision than she would have thought possible. Most men were opaque to her by design, by the social machinery of the time, which required women to see only what men chose to show. Harlan was not opaque. He did not, apparently, see any value in opacity. What moved across his face now was concern of the specific variety that wanted to say don't go and was restraining itself from saying it because he understood it was not his choice to make. "It's not safe," he said instead. "If Rourke knows you've been out here, and he may know by now, then you are a loose thread." "I know." "Julia." He said her name for the first time, and it sounded different coming from him than it did in her own head, more grounded somehow, more present. "I am not asking you to stay here for my sake. I am telling you that if Rourke's people connect you to what you know, you are in genuine danger." "I know that too." "Then let me come with you." She had not expected that. She sat back slightly. "This is your ranch. Tomas can manage for a week. Abel is here. The drive isn't until November." He said it simply, already decided. "You are riding into something that has already resulted in a man's horse being shot out from under him. You should not do it alone." Julia thought about what it would mean to arrive in Santa Fe with Harlan Morgan beside her. She thought about what it would mean for the case, the presence of the man whose interests were directly affected, a witness and a claimant in person rather than an abstraction in a file. She thought about what it would mean for her, and then she stopped thinking about that second part because it was not the relevant consideration and she had work to do. "We leave at first light," she said. They rode to Cimarron that first day and spent the night at a respectable boarding house on the main street, Julia in a room on the second floor and Harlan in a room at the end of the hall. And they ate supper in the dining room where 4 other travelers were also eating, and nobody looked at them twice. A woman and a man at a table together in a frontier town in 1884 was not unusual in any way. They talked over the plan in low voices between bites. She would go to the office and gain access to the files by ordinary means. She was still employed there. Belle had no reason to suspect her yet. She would copy what she needed and get out. And if Belle has already removed the files, then we go to the Territorial Records Office and work from public filings. It will take longer, but the pattern is still there if you know where to look. He nodded. "What do you need from me?" "Stay visible. Be the cattle rancher who has come to town to respond to the legal notice. That's a perfectly plausible reason for you to be in Santa Fe. Go to the courthouse. File a formal response to the notice. Put your name on record as contesting the affidavit." "Put a target on my back," he said. "Put your story on the record," she corrected. "It's different." He looked at her across the table with that expression she had come to associate with the moments when he was deciding to trust her, a slight deliberate opening, like a door being unlocked rather than thrown wide. "All right," he said. They rode south the next 2 days, stopping at a way station on the second night where the food was bad and the beds were worse, but the horses were well rested by morning. Harlan talked more on the road than he did in the ranch house, she found. Something about being in motion loosened him, and he told her about Colorado, about the hard early years of his own operation, about a winter that had killed 1/3 of his herd and left him working line camps in temperatures that froze the hair inside your nose. He told it without self-pity and with occasional dry humor, and she laughed more than she expected to. And when she laughed, he looked at her with the focused attention of a man who has not heard something he particularly likes in some time and wants to hear it again. She told him about Santa Fe, about the office and the peculiar world she inhabited there, between the formal legal world and the domestic world, belonging fully to neither. About the women she had met who were doing the same thing in different fields, claiming the education they could get, and the territory they could hold with quiet relentlessness. About her friend Clara, who was a teacher and who wrote political pamphlets under a false name, and who was, frankly, the bravest person Julia knew. "She sounds like someone who has accepted that the world will not make room for her, so she has decided to make her own room," Harlan said. "Yes, exactly that. Like you." She looked at him sideways. "I haven't made as much room as Clara. You've made enough to ride 11 miles through a dust storm on behalf of a man you've never met because you suspected an injustice was being done." He held her gaze. "That's room enough." She looked back at the road. Her heart was doing something it had not done in a considerable time, which was paying close attention to another person in a way that was not professional or strategic but simply personal. She told it to be practical. It did not listen. They arrived in Santa Fe on a Tuesday afternoon in early October. The city was familiar and comfortable, and Julia had the strange sensation of seeing it differently, as though the road had washed some accustomed film from her eyes. She checked Harlan in at a boarding house on Washington Avenue that was respectable and not too expensive, and told him she would meet him there for supper. Then she walked to the offices of Aldridge and Bell. Franklin Bell was at his desk when she walked in, and he looked up with the smile of a man who is confident he has everything arranged. "Miss Finley, you're back earlier than expected." "The storm delayed me some," she said, and she met his eyes with the expression she had perfected over 6 years of working in that office, the expression that said, "I am useful and reliable and not paying very close attention." Mr. Morgan received the notice, and he seemed surprised. That was technically true. He had seemed surprised that she had not left. He's considering his response. Bell relaxed a fraction. "Good, we should have everything resolved within the month." I have some filing to catch up on, Julia said pleasantly. I'll be out of your way. She spent 3 hours in the filing room. She was methodical. She photographed nothing because this was 1884, and cameras were not office equipment. But she copied, in her precise and rapid hand, key documents from 6 different case files. The land acquisition records connected to Rourke's name. The correspondence between Bell and a Denver law firm that had handled the dissolution of the Colorado Investment Company. A memorandum in Bell's handwriting that referred to a conversation with Whitmore in a way that placed it 3 months before Bell had claimed to have no knowledge of the man. She copied until her hand ached and her notebook was full, and the light in the filing room had shifted from afternoon to early evening. Then she put everything back exactly as she had found it, closed the cabinet, and walked out past Bell's office, calling a cheerful goodnight through the doorway. Bell called back, "Miss Finley, one more thing." She stopped. The back of her neck went cold. She turned with her expression perfect. "Rourke is coming to the office tomorrow morning," Bell said. "He'll want a full briefing on the Morgan matter. Please make sure the file is ready." "Of course," she said. She walked down the stairs and out into the cool October evening, and she did not walk fast because fast was conspicuous, but she turned toward Washington Avenue, and when she knocked on the door of Harlan's room at the boarding house and he opened it, she stepped inside without ceremony and said, "Rourke is coming to the office tomorrow. We need to move faster than I planned." He listened. He always listened. She laid out the new timeline, and he nodded at each point and asked one precise question and accepted her answer without debate. And then he said, "I filed the formal response at the courthouse this afternoon. It's on record. The clerk told me that Rourke's attorney has already submitted a preliminary brief supporting Whitmore's affidavit." "Good. We need to present our counter-evidence to the territorial court before Rourke's attorney gets to brief the judge privately." She opened her notebook. "I have enough. I think I have enough." "Are you sure?" She looked at what she had written and she thought about what she knew, and she said, "No, but I'm as sure as I'm going to get before tomorrow morning." He looked at her for a moment. There was something different about the way he looked at her that evening, in that small and simply furnished room with the lamp burning low and the sounds of Santa Fe coming softly through the window. Something quieter and more direct. "Julia," he said. "Yes. Whatever happens tomorrow, regardless of how the case goes, I want you to know that what you have done for me in the last week, the risk you have taken, means more to me than I know how to say properly." She said, "Don't thank me yet. We haven't won." "I know," he took a breath. "I'm also going to say, because I think the situation warrants honesty, and I have found that I cannot be around you without being honest, that I would like very much to know you once this is settled, not as a legal ally, as a person, as a woman who I have spent a week with and who I think about considerably more than the case." Julia was quiet for just a moment. The lamp flickered. Outside, a horse went past at a trot. She thought about all the reasons this was premature, and all the reasons the timing was terrible, and all the reasons a woman in her position should keep this kind of thing at arm's length, until she had established herself on firmer ground. She said, "I would also like that." He exhaled, a small and private exhale barely audible, and then he nodded once with a gravity that was somehow also tender. "Tomorrow, then." She went back to her own room, which she had arranged with her landlady on short notice. And she did not sleep well, but she slept enough. And in the morning she was at the territorial courthouse when it opened, before Bell arrived at his office, before Rourke arrived in his private carriage, before any of the machinery Rourke had set in motion could make another move. She presented herself to the clerk as a legal representative of the interests of Harlan Morgan in the matter of the estate of Cornelius Morgan, deceased. This was a flexible truth. She was not licensed. But in New Mexico territory in 1884, the licensing requirements were such that a sufficiently confident and knowledgeable person could navigate them, particularly if the presiding judge was not already bought, and the judge available that morning was a man named Sayre who had come down from Colorado and who had no connection to Rourke that Julia had been able to find. She laid the evidence out clearly, methodically, in the order she had arranged it the night before. Abel Cruz's sworn statement, witnessed by two people whose names were on the document. The copies of the correspondence that placed Bell in contact with Whitmore before the official record said Bell knew Whitmore. The timeline contradictions in the affidavit. The pattern of work-adjacent land acquisitions she had documented from public records. Judge Sayer listened with his hands folded on his desk and his expression giving nothing away. When she finished, he said, "This is a serious allegation against members of the bar." "Yes, sir, it is." "And your position in this matter?" "I'm a legal clerk with the firm of Aldridge and Bell, and I am acting in the capacity of a factual witness to the internal handling of this file by my employer, as well as a representative of Mr. Morgan's factual interests." Sayer looked at her for a long moment. He was 60-something, lean, with the weathered look of a man who had been in the territory long enough to have no illusions about it. He said, "The evidence you've presented regarding the affidavit's internal contradictions is substantive. I am going to issue a temporary suspension of the probate proceeding pending a formal review. I am also issuing a summons for Mr. Whitmore to appear before this court within 30 days to defend the affidavit under oath." Julia kept her face very still. "Thank you, Your Honor." "Don't thank me yet. This is a process, not a verdict." He picked up his pen. "But the process is now moving in the right direction." She walked out of the courthouse into the morning sun, and Harlan was waiting on the steps because she had told him to wait there, visible and legitimate. She told him what had happened in a low and rapid voice and watched the tight set of his shoulders ease just slightly. "A suspension is not a dismissal," he said. "No, but it stops the clock. Rourke can't complete the land grab while probate is suspended. And when Whitmore has to face a judge and defend that affidavit under oath, with the contradictions laid out in front of him, I think we will find that his commitment to the lie has limits. What about Bell? Bell has a problem now that is larger than he can manage quietly. Aldridge doesn't know yet. When he finds out, his instinct will be to distance the firm from what Bell did. That gives us an opening." She was right about Aldridge. She spent an hour with him that afternoon, the full hour she had been waiting 6 years to spend, laying everything out in his office with the door closed and watching his face go through several shades of distress before settling on the grayish determination of a man who has decided he prefers his integrity to his comfort. He said almost nothing while she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Miss Finley," he finally said, and then stopped. "I know," she said. "I should have listened more carefully to you over these years." He said it with the difficulty of a man whose pride is involved. "I am sorry for that. I appreciate that." She held his eyes. "What I need now is for you to cooperate with the court review and provide all relevant correspondence from the Bell files." "Yes." He said it with the decisiveness of a man committing to a course. "Yes, I will." 2 weeks later, Gerald Whitmore sat before Judge Sayer and attempted to defend his affidavit, and within the first 40 minutes of examination, he had contradicted himself 4 times on dates alone. By the end of the day, he had recanted the central claim of the document, admitting under direct pressure that he had not been present for the conversations he described, and that he had composed the affidavit based on a version of events provided to him by a third party. He did not name the third party in open court, but the third party was not hard to identify, and Declan Rourke, who had been conducting business in Santa Fe that week with his usual confident visibility, departed very quietly for Taos the morning after Whitmore's recantation, and his attorney filed a withdrawal from the Morgan estate proceedings 2 days after that. The probate of Cornelius Morgan's estate was concluded without further contest on a cold November morning, and Harlan Morgan stood in the courthouse corridor afterward with the papers that confirmed what he already knew in his bones, that the broken spur was his, fully and legally, and without any remaining shadow of claim from anyone else. Julia had been back in Santa Fe the whole time, working. She had been hired by Aldridge, now operating as a solo firm since Bell's departure under significant pressure, in a formal capacity that was meaningfully different from her previous position. She was doing the same work she had always done, but it was acknowledged now. There were different words around it. It was not everything she had wanted, and it was more than she had expected, and she was working on the next thing because there was always a next thing, and that was fine. She was in the office when the door opened and Harlan Morgan walked in. He had ridden down from Colfax County that morning. She would learn, leaving before sunrise. He was wearing a clean shirt and his good hat, and he had the papers in his inside pocket, the ones from the courthouse, and he walked in and found her at her desk, and she looked up. "The broken spur is mine," he said. "I know," she said. "I received the confirmation 3 days ago." "Then you know why I'm here." She did. And she let herself know it fully, without the professional distance she had been maintaining for the past weeks, partly out of necessity, and partly out of the old habit of not letting herself want things that had complicated costs. She was 28 years old, and she had been practical about herself for long enough to know the difference between a sensible choice and a fearful one. She said, "I am going to need you to say it anyway." He said it. He said it with the same directness he had said everything else, without decoration or performance, just the truth of what he felt, which was that he had spent the last month thinking about her every single day, that the broken spur felt different when she was in it, and the road felt longer without her beside him, that he had spent a decade believing he was suited to solitude, and had discovered in the span of a single stormy week that he had been wrong. He said he wanted to court her properly if she would allow it, and he said that he understood her work mattered, and he had no intention of asking her to give anything up for him, but that he would very much like to spend as much time in her company as she would permit. Julia Finley had read thousands of legal documents and written hundreds more, and had, on the whole, found them more reliable than most things people said out loud. She had read Harlan Morgan across a week of close quarters and high stakes, and she knew his document the way she knew the ones she had spent her career building, carefully and without illusion. She said yes. They courted through the winter. It was not a simple thing to court across the distance between Santa Fe and Colfax County, but they managed it with the same practical determination they brought to everything else. He came to Santa Fe twice in November and once in December. She rode north in January when the drives were done and the ranch was quiet, staying again in the east room that smelled like cedar and old lavender, and this time the staying had a different quality, warmer and more deliberate. They talked for hours in the evenings by the fire, about everything, about the law and the land and what was changing in the territory and what was not, about his plans for the spring cattle drive, about her work with Aldridge and the small territories she was claiming within it, about the fact that New Mexico was expected to pursue statehood before too long and what that might mean for the legal landscape, about his father's mistakes and her father's silence, and the ways that the past shaped you whether you wanted it to or not, about what they wanted. Tomas, the young hand who was now 18 and filling out into something quietly formidable, watched all of this from a respectful distance and said nothing, but he had the expression of someone whose opinion of the world had been favorably revised. Abel Cruz, his collarbone healed and his dignity entirely intact, had opinions he expressed freely, and they were positive. In February, Harlan Morgan rode to Santa Fe and did not stay at the boarding house on Washington Avenue, but instead knocked on the door of Julia's lodgings and said, without preliminary, that he would like to marry her. He said it with the papers from the courthouse still metaphorically in his pocket, with the memory of everything they had been through together present in the room between them, and with his hat in his hands and his eyes on her face, and no apparent doubt that this was the right thing to say and the right person to say it to. Julia said, "I would like to keep working." "Yes," he said, "I'm not leaving Santa Fe permanently until I've completed the current matters I'm responsible for. I know, I wouldn't ask you to, And there are things about this territory's legal treatment of women and of certain communities that I intend to continue working against regardless of any other change in my circumstances. I know that too. He met her eyes. Julia, I am not asking you to be less. I am asking you to be mine and let me be yours. Those are different things. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the letter on a table. She thought about a dust storm and a mare and 11 miles of road. She thought about the particular kind of man who, when given the chance to diminish a woman, chooses instead to sit across from her and listen, and does it again, and again, and again, until it becomes simply who he is and how he lives. She said yes. They were married in April in Santa Fe at the small church on Cathedral Place that Julia had occasionally attended out of habit rather than conviction. The ceremony was simple and attended by fewer than 20 people. Aldridge was there. Clara was there, crying into a handkerchief and then looking fierce about having cried, which was very Clara. Abel Cruz was there, looking distinguished in his best clothes. Tomas was there, standing very straight and trying to look like someone to whom weddings were ordinary. Julia wore a dress of deep blue wool that was not traditional in any way, but was exactly right for who she was. Harlan wore his clean shirt and his good hat until the moment the ceremony required the hat to come off, and his face throughout the whole thing was very still and very certain. The way his face was when he had made a decision he completely trusted. They rode north together after 3 days in Santa Fe, north to Colfax County and the Broken Spur, and Julia watched the mountains come up ahead of them the way they had come up the first time she made this journey, big and certain and permanent, and she felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. The Broken Spur in spring was a different thing from the Broken Spur in October. The grass had come back from the drought, greener than she had imagined it, and the creek was running full with snowmelt, and the cattle were scattered across the hillsides in the particular way of cattle that are where they want to be. The ranch house looked different too, she thought, and then she realized it did not look different but that she was looking at it differently, as a place she belonged to rather than a place she was visiting. She set up a small office in the room adjacent to the kitchen. There was enough legal work in Colfax County and the surrounding territory to keep her occupied, and she arranged with Aldridge to continue consulting on certain matters by correspondence, which was imperfect but possible. She began building her own practice, quietly and methodically, because that was how she did everything. Harlan watched all of this with the focused appreciation of a man who has gotten exactly what he wanted and knows it. He was not an easy man to live with in all respects. He had opinions about everything and he stated them directly, and sometimes Julia had to establish very clearly that her opinion was different and equally valid, and they had arguments that were genuinely fierce and ended with both of them having said exactly what they meant and understood exactly what the other person meant, which was, she found, more satisfying than any agreement she had ever reached through the slow, diplomatic process of saying what was expected. He never talked over her. He never finished her sentences. He never looked at a point past her shoulder while she was making a point. 6 months into the marriage, these things still struck her with a small and grateful shock. In the first year, Declan Rourke made one more attempt to encroach on the Broken Spur's water rights, this time through a convoluted arrangement involving an irrigation district that his Taos interests were financing. Julia identified the mechanism in a public filing in November and had a response on record with the territorial court before December. Rourke's attorney sent a letter to Harlan directly, which Julia opened, read, filed, and responded to herself. She heard no more about it. Rourke appeared to have concluded correctly that the Broken Spur's current occupants were not worth the effort. In the fall of the second year, Julia discovered she was expecting a child. She told Harlan on a Sunday evening with the fire going and the cattle sounds coming through the walls and the particular quality of autumn light that turned everything amber, and he went very still for a moment the way he went still when something mattered more than he expected it to. Then he said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I am very well." He crossed the room and sat beside her on the bench by the window, and he took her hand in both of his with a gentleness that was not his most obvious quality but was always, she had found, available when it was needed. He held her hand and looked at the window and the mountains beyond it and did not say anything else for a while, and the not saying anything was very full. Their son was born in the spring of 1887, on a Tuesday morning when the creek was running with snowmelt and the cattle were restless in the east pasture. He was healthy and loud and had his father's dark eyes and what appeared to be his mother's determined expression, which Harlan said at once, and which Julia thought was unfair to attribute to a person who was 4 hours old. They named him James, after no one in particular, because Julia wanted a name that was entirely the child's own, and Harlan agreed. Abel Cruz, who was present in the way that a man of 31 years with a household becomes present at important events, held the baby for a full quarter-hour, and said he was the finest baby he had seen in considerable time. Tomas, who was now 20 years old and effectively running half the ranch operation with a competence that no one who had met him at 17 would have doubted, stood in the doorway of the room with his hat against his chest and looked at the baby with an expression that was very young and very genuine. Julia caught his eye and smiled, and he looked away quickly and cleared his throat. The ranch grew. The herd grew. The spring drive of 1887 was the most profitable the Broken Spur had seen in a decade, which Harlan attributed to the new grazing management approach he had implemented, and which Abel attributed to the weather being kind for once. Julia attributed it to both of those things plus Harlan's renegotiation of the buyer contracts in Dodge City the previous fall, which she had helped him prepare, going through the language with him line by line at the kitchen table with baby James asleep in the wooden cradle Harlan had built himself during the winter. She continued her legal work. She took on 2 land dispute cases for neighboring homesteaders who could not otherwise afford representation, and she won one and negotiated a settlement on the other that was better than either party had initially expected. She maintained her correspondence with Aldridge, whose practice was declining as his health declined, and in those letters she was increasingly the one offering legal analysis rather than receiving it. In 1888, she received a letter from a woman in Denver who ran a small but active suffrage organization and who had heard, through the improbable network that connected women doing this kind of work across the Western Territories, about Julia Finley Morgan and what she had done in the Morgan estate case. The letter asked if she would be willing to contribute a written statement about her experience to a document the organization was compiling about women in legal practice in the Western Territories. She wrote the statement at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning while James played with wooden blocks on the floor beside her. It was long and specific and uncompromising. She sent it without asking anyone's permission, and 3 months later received a letter back saying it had been included in the document, which was being sent to every territorial legislature in the West. Harlan read the original statement after she mailed it, picking it up from the table where she had left a copy. He read it all the way through without saying anything, and when he finished he set it down and looked at her with that expression she had come to know as his particular form of pride, which did not announce itself but was very evident to someone paying attention. He said, "This is good," she said. "I know," he said. "You should send it to Judge Sayer too." She had not thought of that. She sent it to Judge Sayer too. In the late summer of 1888, James was a year and a half old and climbing everything that could be climbed, and Julia knew she was expecting again. She told Harlan in the way she had told him the first time in the evening with the fire going, and he responded in the same way, going still and then reaching for her hand. This time he said, "Do you want me to bring someone in? A doctor, a midwife?" "Mrs. Vargas is coming from Cimarron," Julia said. Mrs. Vargas had delivered James and had strong opinions about everything and was exactly the person you wanted in a room when things became serious. and Clara is coming in February." Clara, he said it with the dry resignation of a man who genuinely respected a person and also found her intimidating. "Good." Clara arrived in February in a state of high energy and strong opinions that expanded to fill every room she occupied, and she and Harlan had 3 vigorous arguments in the first week about water rights legislation, the territorial government's treatment of the Jicarilla Apache community, and whether the new stove configuration was more efficient than the old one. Julia watched these arguments with great pleasure. They were, she thought, exactly what the ranch needed. Their daughter was born in March of 1889, on a day when the last snow of winter was melting off the mountains, and the whole world smelled like cold water and new mud. She was smaller than James had been and quieter, and she looked at things with a focused intensity that Julia recognized immediately, and Harlan found both hilarious and deeply familiar. They named her Anna. Clara cried again and was again fierce about having cried. The summer of 1889 brought news that New Mexico was moving seriously toward a statehood convention. Julia followed this with close attention, corresponding with contacts in Santa Fe and Denver about the implications for the territorial legal structure. She wrote 2 letters to convention organizers about women's property rights and their inclusion in the new state constitution. She did not know if they were read with any seriousness. She sent them anyway. The ranch was full and busy, and the days were long in the good way of days that are full of things that matter. James, at 2.5, was a person of strong opinions and astonishing energy who had developed a devotion to the cattle that Harlan found entirely understandable and Julia found complicated, since the cattle had a tendency to be where James wanted to be, which was everywhere. Tomas had appointed himself James's informal protector in the yard and corrals, a role he took with complete seriousness, and which James exploited with complete shamelessness. Abel Cruz, at 55, had slowed somewhat but had not diminished in any other way. He sat on the porch in the evenings sometimes and watched the mountains, and Julia sat with him on the evenings when Harlan was out late with the herd, and they talked about the territory and its history, and about what it had been like before the ranges were fenced, and what it had been like to work for Cornelius Morgan in the early years, when everything was harder and also somehow simpler. One evening Abel said, "The old man would not know what to make of you." Julia said, "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Abel thought about it. "Good," he said finally. He was uncomfortable with things he did not understand, so he would have been uncomfortable, but he would have come around. He always came around in the end. That was his best quality. "I think his best quality," Julia said, "was raising a son who came back when he was asked." Abel nodded slowly. "That too." The fall drive of 1889 was complicated by a water dispute along the eastern boundary that had been simmering for months, and Julia spent 3 weeks in November working through it with the neighboring rancher, a man named Dawes who was not unreasonable, but was stubborn in the specific way of men who conflate stubbornness with principle. She drafted an agreement that gave each party what they needed and neither party everything they wanted, which was, she had come to understand, the definition of a workable resolution. Dawes signed it, and then told someone in Cimarron that she was the sharpest legal mind in the county, which got back to her through a chain of 3 people, and which she filed away with quiet satisfaction. The winter of 1889 into 1890 was cold and clear, and the kind of still that felt like the world holding its breath. James learned to walk faster than was entirely safe, and Anna watched everything from whatever position she had been placed in with the focused intensity of someone cataloging information for future use. Harlan taught James the names of the cattle, pointing out the individuals the way you might point out neighbors, and James repeated them with the dedicated seriousness of a child who has decided that names are important. On a January evening, with both children asleep and the house quiet and the fire burned down to steady coals, Julia and Harlan sat together on the bench by the east window, where the mountains were visible in the moonlight. a long, clear line of white against the dark sky. They had been talking about plans, practical ranch plans and legal plans, and the kind of plans that are really just conversations about what the future might be, and the conversation had wound down into the comfortable silence they had both learned to trust. Harlan said, without preamble, "I want you to know that I understand what you gave up to be here." Julia looked at him. "I don't think of it as giving up." "I know you don't, but I think about it. A woman with your mind, your ability, in a different place and time, you'd be walking into courtrooms and arguing cases before judges. You'd be on the record in ways that are different from the way you are now." "The way I am now," she said, "is building something. The cases I handle here, the documents I write, the agreements I broker, they matter to people whose land and lives are involved. The statement I sent to Denver is in a compiled document that may influence how territorial legislatures think about women in legal practice. The world is being changed in pieces, and I am holding several of those pieces." She held his gaze. "That is not less than what you described. It is just different." "Is it enough?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains in the moonlight. She thought about the dust storm and the letter and the man who had said, "Stay until you hear mine," with the voice of someone who had decided that truth was the only thing worth offering. She thought about everything they had built in the years since, legal and practical and personal, the cases and the children and the long evenings by the fire, and the arguments that resolved into understanding, and the small daily moments of a shared life that accumulated into something large and permanent. "It is more than I expected," she said honestly, "and less than I intend to stop at." She looked at him. "But yes, right now in this form with this life with you it is enough." He put his arm around her and she leaned against his shoulder. And they sat like that for a while with the fire's warmth on their faces and the mountains white in the distance. And outside the broken spur lay quiet under the winter sky, the water running in the creek that nobody was ever going to take away, the cattle settled in their winter pasture, the land itself exactly as it should be. In the spring of 1890, Julia received a formal invitation from a territorial women's legal association in Albuquerque to present at their annual gathering. She wrote and delivered a paper on women's property rights in cattle country, using the cases she had handled and the patterns she had observed, and she delivered it to a room of 73 women who listened with the particular attention of people who have been waiting for someone to say exactly this. Harlan drove her to Albuquerque for the presentation and sat in the back of the room. She did not find out until afterward that he had been there, because she had not seen him and had not expected him to come. When she came off the small stage to the warmth of the room's response, she found him waiting at the edge of the crowd with a look on his face that was very quiet and very full. He said, "You were extraordinary," she said. "You didn't tell me you were coming. I didn't want you to think about me. You should think about the work when you are doing the work." She stood there in the crowded room with the warmth and the conversation all around them, and she thought about the man she had married, who could have been any of the things she had been warned he would be and who had, consistently and without apparent effort, been something else entirely. A man who came to hear her speak and sat in the back so she could forget he was there. A man who built a cradle in the winter because it was needed, and who taught his son the cattle's names because names matter, and who had not once, in the years she had known him, looked at a point past her shoulder while she was making a point. She took his hand. He closed his fingers around hers with the steadiness she had first noticed in the way he poured a glass of water from a clay pitcher on the afternoon when everything began. They drove home to Colfax County in the April warmth, with the mountains ahead of them and the road stretching out in the clear morning air. And Julia Finley Morgan thought about the letter she had carried 11 miles through a dust storm, and the message she had delivered, and the message she had stayed to hear, and about everything that had grown from those two messages over the years, the truth and the case and the life and the children and the work that was not finished and was not going to be finished, but was absolutely, undeniably worth doing. She thought about all of this with the particular satisfaction of someone who has taken the long view and found it good. The broken spur came into view around a curve of road, the house and the corrals and the green of the spring pasture, and the line of the creek catching the morning light. And James was standing on the porch fence, because Tomas had not been fast enough to stop him, and Anna was watching from her spot on the porch steps with her focused and cataloging expression. And Abel was somewhere around the barn, and the cattle were where the cattle should be. And all of it, every piece of it, was exactly as it should be. Julia said home. Harlan said yes. He said it simply, without decoration, the way he said everything that mattered, and she believed him completely. And the road ended at the gate of the broken spur, and they went through it together, which was how they did everything now, and which was how they intended to do everything for a very long time to come. There was one more thing that happened that spring, small in itself, but significant in the way that small things can be significant when they are the right thing at the right time. Aldridge wrote to say he was retiring and closing the firm entirely, and he asked if Julia would accept a formal transfer of any remaining clients who wished to continue with representation. The letter used language he had clearly thought about carefully, referring to her as a practitioner of the law in a way that went beyond what the territory's licensing structure technically supported, but that was accurate in all the ways that mattered. She wrote back accepting. She wrote back with the same precision and confidence she had always brought to legal correspondence, and she signed it Julia Finley Morgan and sent it south with the Thursday Post. She was 29 years old. She had a ranch and a family and a practice and a partner who sat in the back of rooms so she could forget he was there, and closed his fingers around her hand with a steadiness she had come to count on the way she counted on the water in the creek and the mountains at the edge of the sky. Always there, always real, constant as anything in a country that was still making itself. The years ahead would bring more cases and more arguments and more late evenings by the fire, more cattle drives and difficult winters, and the slow and necessary progress of a territory becoming a state. There would be more children, another son 2 years later who had Julia's reddish-brown hair and Harlan's way of looking at the horizon like it was a problem to be solved, and who they named Cornelius because by then the name had room in it for something other than complication. There would be more letters to legislatures, and more agreements drafted over kitchen tables, and more arguments about water rights, and more moments of the particular joy that comes from work that matters and a life that holds you. But all of that was ahead. Right now there was the gate and the porch and the children and the spring morning and the man beside her who had asked her to stay until she heard his message, and she had stayed, and the message had been the truest thing anyone had ever said to her, and she had built her life on it and found it solid and good and more than enough to stand on for as long as she could see. She went through the gate. She was home.